I didn't feel anything when my husband's heart stopped. Not relief, not grief, just silence, like a door finally closing on a room I'd been locked out of for 31 years. The paramedics were kind. They kept asking if I was okay, if I needed to sit down, if I wanted them to call someone. I told them I was fine. I made coffee while they worked. I don't think they knew what to make of that. Honestly, neither did I. My husband's name was Gerald, Jerry, to everyone who knew him, which wasn't as many people as you'd think for a man who'd lived in the same town in Ohio for 6 decades. He was a careful man, deliberate. He didn't make friends easily, and he didn't keep them long. What he kept was information, records, files going back to the early 1980s, organized in manila folders by year and category, stored in the basement office he'd built himself the summer our youngest started kindergarten. He called it his study. I called it his other life. I want to be honest with you from the beginning, because that's the only reason I'm telling this story at all. I was not a naive woman. I was a retired school teacher with 32 years in the classroom, 2 grown children, and a mother who had raised me to pay attention to what people did, not what they said. I paid attention to Gerald for 3 decades. I saw things I explained away. I felt things I talked myself out of. And when he died at 67 from a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October, I stood in our kitchen and poured a cup of coffee and did not cry. And I understood something about myself I hadn't been willing to face before. I had been waiting for it to be over for a very long time. Gerald and I met in 1987 at a church picnic in Dayton. He was 31, and I was 29, and he had a way about him that I mistook for steadiness. He was quiet in a room full of noise. He remembered everything you told him, your sister's name, the street you grew up on, whether you took sugar in your coffee. At the time, I thought that meant he cared. I understand now it meant he was collecting. We were married the following spring. My mother cried at the wedding, and I remember thinking how happy she looked. And I remember Gerald squeezing my hand at the altar. And I remember thinking, this is the beginning of something safe. I had dated men who were loud and careless, and I had come away from all of them bruised in ways that didn't show, and Gerald seemed like the opposite of all that. He was present, attentive. He always knew where I was. That last part didn't bother me until much later. The first year was fine. The second year, he suggested I leave my teaching position temporarily, just until we were more settled, just until we knew whether we were going to have children. I was a 3rd-grade teacher, and I loved it with my whole chest. The smell of crayons and construction paper, the way a child's face looks when something finally clicks. I told him I didn't want to stop. He said he understood. Then he began showing up at the school. Just to bring me lunch, he said. Just to see where I spent my days. My colleagues thought it was romantic. My principal asked me once, gently, if everything was all right at home. I said yes, without hesitating. Our daughter was born in 1990 and our son 2 years later. I did leave teaching then, for 4 years, and Gerald was pleased in a way that made me uneasy without knowing why. When I went back part-time in 1996, he drove me every day. He said it was because we only had 1 car. That was true. What was also true was that he controlled when we bought cars, which cars we bought, and whose name appeared on the registration. His name. Always his name. I didn't have a credit card in my own name until I was 54 years old. I want you to let that sit for a moment, because I have, many times. 54 years old. I had taught other people's children how to read. I had raised 2 kids of my own. I had managed a household and a garden and a neighborhood book club, and I had never, in 20-plus years of marriage, had a single line of credit attached to my own name, my own history, my own proof that I existed financially in this world. Gerald handled the money. That was the phrase we used, the way you use a phrase so many times it stops meaning anything. Gerald handles the money. He paid the bills and filed the taxes and met with the accountant, a man named Phil, who Gerald had known since college and who I met exactly twice in 31 years, both times briefly, both times while Gerald steered me gently toward the door. I asked questions sometimes. Early on, I asked more. Gerald would answer in ways that were technically responsive, but told me nothing. Numbers without context, explanations that required other explanations, documents he'd summarize but not show. Eventually, I stopped asking as much, not because I was told to, because asking made me feel stupid, and I didn't want to feel stupid in my own home, and it was easier to trust him than to keep running into that wall. I understand now that the wall was the point. Our children grew up and moved away and came back for holidays and grew into people I am extraordinarily proud of. Our daughter is a physical therapist in North Carolina. Our son teaches high school history in Pittsburgh, which still makes me laugh. He got that from me, I think, though he'd probably argue it. They both had complicated relationships with their father. Gerald was not cruel to the children, not directly, but he had a way of managing them the same way he managed everything else. He approved of certain friends and not others. He had opinions about their choices that he delivered as facts. When our daughter was 23 and told him she was moving in with her boyfriend, Gerald didn't yell. He just became cold in a way that lasted for 2 years, and she spent those 2 years trying to warm him back up. She told me after he died that she had always been a little afraid of him, not of being hit, of being frozen out, of becoming someone he no longer acknowledged. I told her I understood exactly what she meant. The office in the basement had been there since 1994. Gerald had built the walls himself, installed a door with a keyed lock, and from the day it was finished, he locked it every night before bed. Every night. I watched him do it thousands of times. He would walk down the stairs and I would hear the click, and he would come back up, and that would be that. I never asked what was in there. Once early on, I tried the handle while he was at work and found it locked. And when he came home that evening, he mentioned, casually, that he'd noticed the handle had been touched. He didn't say it as an accusation, just a fact. But I never touched the handle again. When he died and the paramedics left and the house got quiet, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My daughter was driving from North Carolina. My son was on his way from Pittsburgh. I had called them both, and I had used a steady voice. And I'd said the words, and they had each, in their own way, gone quiet on the other end of the line. I sat at that table and I thought about calling my sister. I thought about calling the pastor from the church we'd attended for 20 years. I thought about crying. Instead, I walked downstairs. I don't know what I expected. I don't think I expected anything. I had lived with that locked door for so long that it had become just a part of the house. Like a load-bearing wall you don't think about until someone tells you it's the only thing holding the ceiling up. But Gerald was gone, and his keys were on the kitchen counter where the paramedics had set his things. And for the first time in 31 years, I could just go and see. The key was the small brass one on the ring. I stood in front of that door for a moment, then I turned the lock and pushed it open. It smelled like him in there, that particular combination of old paper and the cedar blocks he put in every closet and faint aftershave. The light was a single overhead bulb, and when I pulled the chain, it lit up a room that was, at first glance, completely ordinary. A desk, a filing cabinet, metal shelves along one wall covered in labeled binders, a small safe in the corner I hadn't known existed. I stood in the doorway for a long time before I moved. The binders were the first thing. They were organized by year, going back to 1989, the year before we were married. I pulled the one labeled with the current year and opened it on the desk. Inside were financial documents, account statements, property records, names I didn't recognize attached to assets I didn't know we had. A rental property in Indiana I had never heard mentioned once. A brokerage account in Gerald's name alone with a balance that made me sit down in his desk chair and stare at the wall. We had told our children when they asked about money that we were comfortable, but not wealthy. We had taken modest vacations. I had clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, out of habit because Gerald said we should be careful. I had worn the same winter coat for 9 years because I didn't want to be wasteful. There was enough money in that brokerage account to have bought me a new coat every winter for the rest of my natural life. I kept pulling binders. The picture that assembled itself was slow and then all at once. The way understanding sometimes works, the way you can look at something for years, and then one day the angle shifts and you see the whole shape of it. Gerald had been managing a financial life that I was not a part of. Our joint accounts, the ones with my name on them, the ones I was aware of, were a fraction of what existed. The house was in a trust I had never seen the documents for. The trust named Gerald as sole trustee. My name appeared in it exactly once, as beneficiary of a modest monthly allowance should he predecease me, an allowance that was less than what I'd been spending on groceries. I found the document about my medical records near the back of a binder from 2008. I have to be careful about how I describe this because I still don't fully understand all of it legally, but what I found was a healthcare proxy form, filled out and notarized, designating Gerald as my sole medical decision maker. That alone is not unusual between spouses. What was unusual was the attached memo, handwritten in Gerald's precise small script, containing notes from conversations with my doctor, notes that I, as the patient, had never been shown. Notes where Gerald had, in answer to a question I apparently hadn't been present for, described me as having some cognitive difficulty and some trouble with complex information. I sat with that piece of paper for 20 minutes. I read it 4 times. Then I set it down on the desk very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of dropping, and I looked at my own hands and I thought, he was building a case. For what? I didn't know yet. But he was building a case that I was not competent to manage my own affairs, and he had been building it for 15 years. My daughter arrived first. She came downstairs and found me in that office, and she stood in the doorway and looked at me and at the papers spread across the desk, and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, how long have you known about this room?" I said, "I've always known about the room. I just didn't know what was in it." She sat beside me, and we went through the binders together. My son arrived an hour later and joined us. Neither of them said much. At some point, my daughter started crying, quietly, without explanation. My son made a sound once, a short, hard exhale, when we found the rental property documents. I thought about Gerald telling him 4 years ago that he couldn't loan him the money for a down payment because they didn't have that kind of liquidity. The safe required a locksmith. He came the next morning, a young man who had the tact not to ask questions, and when it opened we found 2 passports, both Gerald's, different names, both expired, both from the 1990s. I don't know the whole story of those passports. I may never know, but I looked at those 2 faces. Same face, different names, and I thought about the man who had squeezed my hand at the altar and told me this was the beginning of something, and I understood that he had always known something I hadn't, that he was more than one person, and only one of them had married me. I called a lawyer that week, not Phil, the accountant, a woman named Diane who worked out of a small office on the other side of town and who had been recommended by my sister, who had been recommended by my sister's friend, which meant Gerald had never met her and had no file on her. Diane was 61 and direct, and she wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she looked at the documents I brought her and did not seem surprised by any of it, which surprised me. She said she'd seen variations of this before. She said it had a name. She said there were things we could do. I want to tell you that the legal process was fast and clean and satisfying. It wasn't. It took 14 months. There were hearings and motions and documents, and one particular afternoon in a conference room where Gerald's estate attorney, a man who had known Gerald for decades and who I believe knew more than he said, implied, gently, that perhaps I had been too confused to understand the financial arrangements my husband had made. I looked at him across that conference table. I thought about the handwritten memo describing my cognitive difficulties. I thought about 31 years of being spoken for. I thought about my daughter, who drove from North Carolina 4 times during those 14 months to sit in that conference room beside me. I thought about my son, who had started going to therapy, partly because of all of this, and who had called me one night to say that he was finally learning the word for what he'd grown up watching. I told the estate attorney, clearly and calmly, that I had taught reading to 8-year-olds for 32 years, and I was fairly certain I could understand a trust document if someone would finally hand me one. Diane beside me said nothing, but I saw her write something in her notepad, and I thought I saw the corner of her mouth move. We settled 14 months after Gerald died. I won't tell you every detail because some of it is still sensitive, but I will tell you that my name is now on the house. My name is on the accounts. I have a financial advisor, a person I chose, a person Gerald never met, and I have a credit card in my own name that I've had for a year and a half now, and I still feel something when I use it that I don't have a word for. Not triumph, exactly, more like proof. Our daughter called me last month to ask how I was doing, really doing, not just the answer I give people. I told her I was sleeping better than I had in years, that I'd started taking a class at the community center, watercolor, which I'd always wanted to try, and Gerald had always found impractical, that I'd had lunch twice with a woman from the class whose name was Barbara and who made me laugh in a way I hadn't expected. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, did you love him?" I thought about it honestly. I said, I loved who I thought he was. I think I spent 30 years loving a story he told me about himself. And I think part of me always knew the story had holes in it, and I just kept spackling over them because I didn't know what was underneath. She said that sounded like something that would take a long time to make peace with. I told her I wasn't in a hurry. I still have all the binders. Diane says I should keep them, at least for now. They're in a box in the closet in what used to be Gerald's study, a room that I repainted last spring in a color called Quiet Morning, which is a pale blue-green that catches the afternoon light in a way I find genuinely beautiful. I put a small reading chair in the corner. I put my watercolor supplies on the shelf where the filing cabinet used to be. Sometimes I go in there and I sit in that chair and I think about the woman who stood in that kitchen and felt nothing and poured herself a cup of coffee. And I try to be gentle with her. She wasn't cold. She wasn't broken. She was someone who had been told, in 1,000 quiet ways, that her instincts were wrong, her perceptions were faulty, her understanding was incomplete. And she had survived all of that by learning not to feel too much in the moment, so she could feel it later, in her own time, in her own room, in a house that finally, after all this time, has her name on it. If any part of this story sounds familiar to you, the being spoken for, the not quite having access to your own life, the sense that something is off that you can't name and don't quite trust yourself to name, I want to say to you what I wish someone had said to me 20 years ago. Your instincts are not broken. The confusion you feel is not a sign that you're too simple to understand. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who work the hardest to keep us from seeing clearly. And the view from the other side, I promise you, is worth it. I kept a piece of paper from the settlement, not a legal document, just a note I wrote to myself on the drive home from the courthouse, parked in a lot off the highway, engine still running. It says, "Today I got my name back." I keep it in my wallet. I don't need it there as a reminder anymore, but I like knowing it's there. I like knowing that I was the one who wrote it, in my own hand, in my own words, without anyone answering for me.